On the south bank of the Perfume River, a concrete wall lay folded over itself like wet cardboard. Behind it, what had been a North Vietnamese machine gun position, sandbags, ammunition cans, a cooking pot still upright on a small stove, sat open to the sky. The roof gone, 2 walls gone. The fighting holes behind the compound had collapsed inward. Smoke curled from a crater where the courtyard had been, and the air tasted like powdered limestone and something chemical, something sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. 30 meters back down the street, engine ticking, sat the thing responsible. It looked like a mistake. Squat, flat, barely taller than the Marines crouching beside it. The M50 Ontos carried no turret. 6 recoilless rifles, 3 on each side, jutted from its flanks like quills on something cornered. The hull could not have been longer than 12.5 feet. Armor so thin a heavy machine gun round could punch through at close range. The treads belonged on a vehicle half its ambition. Marines in Hue called it the pig, the thing, the little bastard. The North Vietnamese army troops dug into the Citadel, and the neighborhoods south of the river called it something else. They learned to listen for the sound of its engine and move before it stopped. February 1968. The Tet Offensive had turned Hue into the only sustained urban battle American forces fought in Vietnam. NVA regulars, not guerrillas, not local Viet Cong, but trained battalion-strength infantry from the north, held the city in depth. They fortified pagodas, schools, private homes, government buildings. They punched loopholes through interior walls so they could move between buildings without crossing open ground. Their positions interlocked. Fields of fire overlapped. They had prepared for a siege, and for the first several days, they fought like professionals, holding terrain they intended to keep. The Marines sent to retake the city arrived with doctrine built for open country. Tanks bogged in the narrow streets. Air support, restricted by weather and by the South Vietnamese government's reluctance to bomb its own imperial capital, came in fragments. Artillery had similar political constraints. What the Marines needed, and did not initially have enough of, came on tracks and weighed less than 10 tons. If you served in Hue, rode one of these, or heard a story from someone who did, put it in the comments. That kind of detail matters here. Hit subscribe and like, so this channel keeps reaching the people who care about getting it right. The Ontos had nearly been canceled. Twice. The Army rejected it in the late 1950s. Too light, too fragile, too narrow in purpose. The Marine Corps kept it because the Marine Corps operates on a budget that makes the armies look obscene, and because Marines have a long institutional memory for the value of direct fire support that can follow infantry through terrain a tank cannot reach. The M50 fit on a landing craft. It could cross bridges rated for civilian traffic. It could reverse out of an alley faster than a tank crew could traverse their turret. None of that mattered in the jungle. For most of the Vietnam War, the Ontos sat at base perimeters or ran patrols on roads, where its thin armor and small crew, 3 men, made it a liability against mines and ambush. The vehicle had no reputation. Marines assigned to Ontos crews did not brag about it. Hue changed the arithmetic. In a city, the distances collapsed. Engagement ranges dropped to 50 meters, sometimes less. The NVA could not use their standard tactic of breaking contact and melting into tree lines. They held fixed positions because the positions were the objective. And against a fixed position inside a masonry building at short range, 6 recoilless rifles firing in ripple or volley did something no other weapon in the Marine inventory could replicate. The Ontos did not suppress a position. It deleted it. The backblast alone blew debris across intersections. The high-explosive anti-tank rounds, designed to kill armored vehicles, turned stone walls into fragmentation. One volley carried 18 pounds of warhead into a space the size of a living room. The NVA garrison in Hue numbered between 8 and 11,000. They held the city for 26 days. The Marines who broke them had fewer than a dozen Ontos available at any point during the battle. 1952. The Korean War ground into its second winter, and the Army wanted something light enough to drop from a cargo plane and mean enough to kill a T-34. The specification called for an air-deployable tank destroyer. Fast, expendable, armed with recoilless rifles that could knock out Soviet armor at ranges where the crew still had a chance of surviving the exchange. Alvis Corporation built the prototype, 6 106mm recoilless rifles mounted on a chassis that weighed, combat-loaded, just under 9.5 tons. They called it the Ontos, Greek for the thing. Even the name sounded like an afterthought. The Army tested it at Aberdeen Proving Ground through 1955 and 1956. The evaluation reports survive, and they read like a slow rejection letter. The armor could stop small arms fire and shell fragments, but nothing heavier. The crew compartment fit 3 men so tightly that the driver's hatch doubled as the only forward viewport when buttoned up. Ammunition stowage inside the hull held exactly 18 rounds, 3 reloads for 6 guns. Every reload required a crewman to climb outside, exposed, and physically insert each round into its breech from the vehicle's flanks. In a nuclear battlefield scenario, which dominated Army thinking at the time, the Ontos offered no crew protection worth mentioning. The Army passed. Officially, the vehicle failed to meet operational requirements for a modern combined arms force. The rejection landed on a desk at Quantico, and somebody at Marine Corps Development Center read it differently. The Marines did not need a tank destroyer for the plains of Northern Europe. They needed something that could roll off a landing craft, cross a beach, push inland through broken terrain, hills, villages, jungle edges, the kind of ground where a 40-ton tank either couldn't go or couldn't arrive fast enough to matter, and deliver direct fire support to rifle companies on the move. The Ontos could do all of that. It drew less fuel than an M48 Patton. It required 3 crewmen instead of 5. The 6 rifles gave it a volley capability that no other vehicle its size could match. A single Ontos could put 6 rounds downrange in under 10 seconds, saturating a target area with the kind of violence normally reserved for a full artillery battery firing for effect. The recoil from all 6 firing simultaneously rocked the vehicle backward on its tracks. Marines who crewed them reported the sensation felt less like firing a weapon and more like being rear-ended by a truck. The Marine Corps ordered 297. They arrived at fleet units starting in 1957, and almost immediately the problems the Army had identified became daily irritants. The outside reload procedure meant that every engagement carried a hard ceiling. 6 shots, then vulnerability. The 50 caliber spotting rifles mounted atop each main gun helped with first-round accuracy, but burned through their own limited ammunition. Maintenance demanded constant attention. Hydraulic lines leaked, track tension drifted, and the engine compartment ran hot enough to warp gaskets in tropical climates. None of this killed the program. The Marines kept the Ontos for the same reason they kept the M14 after the Army adopted the M16. Institutional stubbornness, backed by a specific tactical logic that Washington never fully understood. By 1965, when the 1st Marine Battalions landed at Da Nang, the Ontos went with them. It went because nobody at Headquarters Marine Corps had found a reason compelling enough to pull it from the table of equipment, and because the men who trained on it, a small, odd community within the already odd world of Marine armor, believed in what those 6 rifles could do. 80,000. That's how many NVA and Viet Cong troops attacked simultaneously across South Vietnam on the night of January 30th, 1968. Over 100 cities and towns hit in coordinated assaults timed to the Lunar New Year ceasefire. Most attacks collapsed within days. Hue did not. 2 NVA regiments, the 4th and the 6th, reinforced by sapper battalions and local force companies, crossed into the city before dawn on January 31st. They moved with lists, names of South Vietnamese government officials, military officers, teachers, anyone connected to the Saigon administration. Within hours, they controlled the Citadel, the Imperial Palace, and most of the South Bank. The American compound at MACV held, though barely, with a handful of advisors firing from windows. Everything else belonged to the North Vietnamese. The Citadel walls mattered more than anything else in the battle's geometry. Built in 1803 under Emperor Gia Long, modeled on Vauban fortifications the French had perfected a century earlier. Walls 6.5 feet thick at the base, ringed by a moat. with earthen ramparts behind the stone facing that absorbed explosive force the way sandbags absorb rifle rounds. The NVA did not just occupy the Citadel, they inherited a fortress designed to resist cannon fire, and they improved it. Bunkers inside the walls, fighting positions along the ramparts, supply caches distributed through the interior, communication trenches linking one strongpoint to the next so no single strike could cripple logistics. South of the river, French colonial buildings offered a different kind of protection. Poured concrete, stone facades, interior walls thick enough to stop a .50 caliber round. The NVA fortified them in depth, connecting structures through mouse holes knocked between adjoining walls. A Marine rifle squad could clear one room and take fire from 3 directions before reaching the next. Like fighting inside a maze made of concrete, one company commander reported to 1st Marine Regiment headquarters. The first infantry assaults on February 2nd cost Alpha Company 1st Battalion, 1st Marines 11 killed, and more than 50 wounded in a single afternoon. The company had started the day at roughly full strength. Air support stayed marginal. Low cloud ceiling through most of February kept fixed-wing sorties sporadic. Naval gunfire from ships in the South China Sea could reach parts of the city but risked leveling the blocks Marines needed to advance through. The tools available, M16s, M60 machine guns, hand grenades, law rockets, could suppress a position but rarely destroy it. Something with more violence per shot sat idling at the MACV compound, waiting for someone to figure out what it could do. The first volley hit a 2-story schoolhouse on Tranchauvan Street at a range of 40 meters. The front wall, poured concrete, French colonial construction, thick enough to stop anything a rifle squad carried, folded inward in a white flash that left the street dark for a full second before the dust caught the light. 6 rounds. All 6. The crew had fired in ripple, left to right, and the impacts walked across the facade like someone dragging a finger through wet sand. When the dust thinned, the building had no second floor. The ground level gaped open, roof beams angled down into rubble, and a haze of calcium dust hung so thick it looked solid. Marines from 2nd Platoon, Alpha Company, moved forward through air they could taste. Powdered merite and calcium oxide coating their tongues, gritty between their teeth. No return fire came from the position. The NVA squad that had held the schoolhouse, 7 or 8 men, based on the weapons recovered afterward, had been firing an RPD machine gun and several AK-47s from the second-floor windows less than 90 seconds earlier. The after-action report from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, logs the engagement at 0940 on February 4th. Sources conflict on whether this constituted the first Ontos engagement in Hue proper or the second. A vehicle from Anti-Tank Company, 1st Tank Battalion, had reportedly fired on a position near the MACV compound the previous afternoon. But the battalion log for February 3rd contains a gap between 1400 and 1700 hours. The sequence matters less than this. The infantry watched what happened and immediately understood. The tactic crystallized within hours. A rifle squad identified a fortified position, usually by taking fire from it. The squad marked the building and pulled back. The Ontos crept forward, engine growling at idle speed, low enough to use rubble piles and wrecked vehicles as partial cover. The crew chief, standing in his hatch, glassed the target, called corrections, and fired the .50 caliber spotting rifles to confirm the range. Then, the volley. Sometimes 2 rifles, sometimes 4, sometimes all 6 depending on the target. The 106mm heat rounds detonated on contact with a shaped charge jet designed to penetrate 12 inches of rolled, homogeneous steel. Against masonry, the effect looked less like a weapon and more like demolition. Walls did not crack. They ceased to exist as structures. "We used it like a sniper rifle the size of a car," a platoon sergeant from Bravo Company told Marine Corps oral history interviewers years later. The reload remained the vulnerability. After each volley, a crewman climbed out, no hatch on the side, just up and over the hull, and stood exposed on the vehicle's flank, feeding 34-pound rounds into the breeches by hand. Each rifle took its own round, 6 rifles, 6 reloads, and every second outside the hull stretched long. NVA marksmen figured this out quickly. Sniper fire during reload became the primary threat to Ontos crews within the first week. The Marines adapted by positioning rifle teams on rooftops and upper floors to suppress known sniper positions during the reload cycle, turning a three-man vehicle into a combined arms system that required a full squad to operate safely. The NVA adapted too. They stopped using large buildings as primary strongpoints when an Ontos operated in the sector. They shifted to smaller positions, harder to identify. A single room, a basement window, a gap in a compound wall, a hole knocked through a garden. Positions that could be abandoned in seconds when the engine sound reached a certain proximity. The after-action reports from mid-February note a measurable decline in NVA willingness to hold fixed positions on streets wide enough for the Ontos to traverse. This mattered. The NVA defensive plan depended on interlocking fires from fortified structures. Every position they abandoned voluntarily weakened the positions adjacent to it. The Ontos did not need to destroy every strongpoint. It needed to make holding a strongpoint feel like suicide, and 6 106mm rounds arriving in under 10 seconds accomplished that with a persuasiveness no briefing could match. By February 8th, company commanders south of the river requested Ontos support before requesting tanks. The vehicle nobody wanted had become the thing nobody could fight without. North of the Perfume River, the geometry changed. The Citadel's outer walls absorbed the first Marine attempts the way they had absorbed cannonballs 2 centuries earlier. On February 13th, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines crossed the river and entered the southeast corner of the fortress through a breach near the Thong 2 gate. They carried M16s, LAW rockets, grenades, 3.5-inch bazookas. The LAW rockets, designed to kill armored vehicles with a focused-shaped charge, hit the ramparts and gouged craters 8 inches deep into earthen walls that ran 6 feet thick. The bazookas performed marginally better. Neither weapon opened a hole large enough for a man to pass through. NVA. Positions built into the wall's interior, shielded by compacted earth and stone facing on both sides, continued firing after repeated direct hits. Marines died in the open trying to close on positions that simply would not break. Getting an Ontos across the river and into the Citadel required a route through streets the NVA still contested. The Nguyen Huang Bridge, the only vehicle crossing, sat under observed fire from positions on both banks. On February 15th, 2 Ontos from Anti-Tank Company made the crossing under smoke cover laid by Marine mortars. One took a B-40 rocket-propelled grenade, hit on its right track assembly during the approach, and ground to a stop 30 meters short of the north bank. The crew bailed out under small arms fire. The second vehicle made it across, threaded through rubble-choked streets inside the Citadel's eastern quarter, and reached Alpha Company's forward position near the Imperial Palace's outer wall by late afternoon. The crew chief, his name appears in the battalion log only as a staff sergeant, no surname recorded in the declassified version, studied the wall from 50 meters. The rampart rose 12 feet above street level at that point, with an NVA fighting position dug into the top where the earthen berm met the stone facing. The position contained at least one heavy machine gun, a DSHK 12.7mm that had killed 2 Marines from Alpha Company's 3rd Squad that morning. Rifle fire could not reach the crew behind the berm. Mortars dropped onto the position, had their blast absorbed by the earthwork. The Ontos rolled forward to 15 meters. 15 meters from a wall built to resist Napoleon-era siege artillery. The crew chief fired 2 spotting rounds. Both struck within a foot of each other, dead center on the stone facing below the fighting position. He triggered 4 of the 6 rifles in a staggered ripple that took less than 3 seconds. The shaped charge jets hit stone first, punched through, then detonated inside the compacted earth behind it. A section of wall 4 feet wide simply blew outward from the far side, spraying dirt and stone fragments across the interior courtyard. The fighting position above collapsed downward into the cavity. Smoke and dust vented from the breach like exhaust from a pipe. "Opened it up like a can," a Marine from 3rd Platoon told a CBS camera crew 2 days later. Alpha Company's assault element moved through the breach within minutes. They found the DSHK buried under 2 feet of displaced earth. Its barrel bent 15 degrees from the collapse. The crew, 3 men, based on the equipment found, had not evacuated. The position that had held for 2 days against every weapon the Marines carried fell to a single vehicle firing from a distance a man could cover at a jog. This became the template for the next 11 days. Ontos vehicles, never more than 4 operational inside the Citadel at any given time, often fewer, moved from breach point to breach point under infantry escort. Each firing position required the crew to expose themselves at ranges where an RPG gunner with steady hands could end everything. The backblast from the recoilless rifles at 15 meters kicked debris back across the vehicle's hull, showering the crew with stone chips and powdered mortar. Crewmen wrapped rags around their faces. The engine intake filters clogged constantly with calcium dust and required cleaning every few hours. On February 19th, an Ontos took a direct RPG hit to the hull while positioned for a breach shot near the Dongba Tower. The shaped charge penetrated the thin armor and killed the drivers instantly. The crew chief and gunner crawled out through the commander's hatch under fire. Both reached friendly lines. The vehicle burned for 40 minutes, its remaining ammunition cooking off in sporadic cracks that kept Marines pinned along a 100-meter stretch of wall. The replacement vehicle arrived the next morning. The advance continued. Block by block, through courtyards choked with shattered tile and fallen beams, the Ontos punching holes through walls that had stood since the Nguyen dynasty. Marines pouring through each breach into positions the NVA could no longer hold once the stone stopped protecting them. Every advantage the Ontos carried came with a cost that should have killed it. The backblast alone turned each firing into a beacon. 6 Recoilless rifles discharge rearward with nearly the same force they send forward. That's how the weapon eliminates recoil on a vehicle too light to absorb it. The blast zone behind an Ontos extended 40 meters. Superheated gas, unburned propellant, dust, gravel, chunks of masonry, all of it launched backward in a cone visible from blocks away. At night, the flash lit entire intersections in orange-white light that lasted 2 full seconds. Any NVA observer within a quarter mile knew exactly where the vehicle sat after a single shot. The crew could not fire and remain hidden. Every volley functioned as a signal flare addressed to every RPG gunner in the district. The armor offered nothing resembling protection. 13 millimeters of aluminum on the hull, thinner than the steel on a 1944 Sherman. An AK-47 round at close range could penetrate certain angles. The DSHK heavy machine gun went through it reliably at 200 meters. RPGs did not so much penetrate as pass through. The shaped charge jet, encountering so little resistance that the spall pattern inside the crew compartment spread wider than it would against thicker plate. A near miss from a mortar could shred the hydraulic lines for the gun elevation system, turning 6 rifles into 6 immobile tubes pointed at whatever angle they held when the fluid drained out. The Gambian pouched rat can grew to 3 feet long, including its tail, and has been trained to detect landmines in Mozambique by scent. This connects to nothing. On February 22nd, a 3-man Ontos crew positioned near the southwest wall of the Citadel fired a 4-round volley into a bunker complex at 20 meters. The backblast threw a cloud of pulverized brick across the street behind them that hung in the air for nearly a minute, a pale brown curtain dense enough to obscure the buildings on the far side. Before the dust settled, an NVA RPG team 300 meters north fired 2 rounds at the signature. Both missed. The crew chief ordered the driver to reverse immediately. The Ontos backed 40 meters down the street, stopped behind a collapsed garden wall, and the loader climbed out to reload. He stood on the vehicle's left flank, feeding rounds into the upper breaches, arms extended above his head, silhouetted against a white stucco wall for the 90 seconds the process required. A sniper round struck the breech housing 6 inches from his right hand. He finished the reload. The after-action report notes the reload time, but not the crewman's name. What made the Ontos terrifying to face had nothing to do with its specifications. A weapon system this exposed should have been pulled back, used from standoff distance, employed only when air cover could suppress the response. The Marines did none of that, They pushed it forward to 15 meters to 40 meters into streets where the backblast bounced off walls on both sides and showered the crew with their own debris. They sent a three-man crew in an aluminum box into positions where a competent RPG gunner had a reasonable chance of killing everyone inside. And they did it repeatedly, methodically, day after day for 26 days. The Marines treat it like it cannot be destroyed, a captured NVA company commander told ARVN interrogators on March 3rd. The interrogation transcript uses the Vietnamese word for reckless. The translator rendered it as without consideration for consequences. That translation misses the point. The crews considered the consequences thoroughly, climbing out to reload knowing snipers watched, firing knowing the backblast announced their position to every RPG team in range, driving forward knowing 13 millimeters of aluminum separated them from heavy machine gun rounds designed to destroy aircraft. The calculation held because the alternative, infantry crossing open ground against fortified concrete and earthen walls without the Ontos, cost more lives. The crews knew the arithmetic. The infantry standing behind them knew it too. The NVA faced something worse than a powerful weapon. They faced men who understood exactly how vulnerable that weapon made them and drove it forward anyway. A tank inspires caution. An armored vehicle that cannot survive the return fire it invites, crewed by men who accept that bargain and keep accepting it, morning after morning, street after street, inspires something else entirely. The loader finished his reload, dropped back through the hatch, and the Ontos rolled forward to its next firing position. The elevation crank on a 106 mm recoilless rifle turns with a resistance of about 4 pounds, light enough to adjust with 2 fingers, heavy enough to hold position under the vehicle's vibration. 26 days of calcium dust ground into that mechanism like paste. Crews stripped and oiled the cranks every night. Some mornings they still seized. On March 2, 1968, the NVA flag came down from the Citadel's main flagpole. RVN soldiers raised the South Vietnamese colors in its place. The Battle for Hue had lasted exactly those 26 days, and the city that emerged bore so little resemblance to the city that existed on January 30th that aerial photographs from before and after look like different places. 80% of the structures south of the Perfume River sustained damage. Inside the Citadel, entire blocks had been reduced to knee-high rubble fields where the Ontos had punched breach after breach through walls older than the American Republic. The Marine Corps lost 147 killed in Hue, over 800 wounded. NVA dead exceeded 5,000. The Ontos crews, never more than a few dozen men operating fewer than a dozen vehicles at peak strength, had fired into more fortified positions than any other single weapon system employed in the battle. The after-action reviews praised the vehicle in language the Marine Corps had never used for it before Tet. Commanders, who had treated it as a footnote in the table of organization, now called it indispensable for urban operations. The Marine Corps retired the Ontos in 1969. The decision had been locked in before Hue. Production ended in 1957. Spare parts had dried up years earlier, and the vehicle's role in the official force structure, tank killer, belonged to helicopters and guided missiles now. Hue changed none of that. The bureaucratic machinery that had been grinding toward retirement for half a decade did not pause to reconsider. The vehicles came out of service across all Marine units by the end of the fiscal year. Crews reassigned to other billets. The MOS code for Ontos crewmen disappeared from the training pipeline. No replacement filled the gap. The Marine Corps entered the 1970s without a light, fast, high-firepower vehicle designed for the kind of close urban combat that Hue had cost so much to learn. When American forces fought house to house in Fallujah 36 years later, commanders improvised solutions to problems the Ontos had solved in February of 1968. The records from anti-tank company list serial numbers for each vehicle deployed to Hue. Most of those serial numbers terminate in maintenance logs dated 1969 or early 1970, struck from inventory, hulls sent to depot, scrapped. A few found their way to surplus yards. Collectors bought some in the 1980s when you could still get one for the price of a used truck. One sits at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Triangle, Virginia. It stands in a climate-controlled gallery, paint fresh, rifles angled slightly upward, tracks clean. A placard explains what it carried and where it fought. The aluminum hull shows no dents, no spall marks, no calcium dust ground into the seams. It looks like it rolled off the Alice Chalmers line yesterday. The vehicle that fought in Hue, dust in every crevice, hydraulic fluid leaking from patched lines. A crew chief standing in the hatch with a rag over his face, scanning for the next firing position, while his loader climbed the hull with a 34-pound round in each hand. That vehicle exists only in after-action reports and the memories of men who rode it forward into streets where the math said they should die. 13 millimeters of armor, 6 rifles, 3 men per crew, 26 days,